All right, so we're diving into Focus by Ries today, huh? Looks like we've got a pretty hefty stack of excerpts here. You really want to get a leg up in the business world, and this book, it really zeroes in on why that laser focus is so important, especially these days with, well, just so many choices and distractions everywhere you look.
You know, it's interesting. What really struck me is how Ries kind of goes against the grain, challenging that almost automatic drive for businesses to just keep growing bigger and bigger.
Yeah, okay. Help me unpack that a little bit because, I mean, the growth is important, right? So where's the danger in that?
Well, Ries, he starts off with a pretty powerful example. Just imagine, like, if General Motors, way back then, had just kept growing at a steady 20% every single year. In just a little over 2 decades, their projected revenue, get this, it would have been an absolutely insane $7.1 trillion.
Whoa, hold on. That's more than, like, the entire U.S. economy today.
You got it. And that's exactly his point. You see, growth without focus, without a clear direction to guide it, it can turn a company into this, like, massive, unwieldy giant just sprawling all over the place. Ries, he calls it the unfocusing of corporate America. And the book, it's full of examples of how that strategy just totally backfires.
Yeah, like that cautionary tale of Playboy Enterprises, right?
Yeah.
They were huge, a global phenomenon with the magazine, but then they tried to do it all clubs, books, videos, you name it, and most of it just flopped. So what happened there? Was it just like the Playboy brand got stretched too thin?
It's a great question, and I think it highlights this key concept that Ries calls line extension. Basically, when a company tries to ride the coattails of their brand name and just like launch new products in totally different categories, sounds logical on the surface, but it often fails because it ends up diluting what the brand actually stands for, leaving customers confused. It's like Playboy maybe overestimated how far their brand recognition would really go in markets that were, well, so different from their core business.
Interesting. So sticking to what you're known for and, really owning that, maybe that's the better approach.
Exactly. Nail it. And Ries, he gives us another example, one that might actually surprise you. McDonald's. They're always rolling out new menu items, right? But if you look closely, their revenue increases. They weren't actually keeping up with, basic food inflation.
You're saying all that effort to be innovative, to keep adding new stuff, maybe that wasn't the best strategy.
Well, what Ries suggests is that sticking to their core menu and just like adjusting prices to match inflation, it might have been just as effective, if not even better. It's a powerful reminder to really analyze whether new additions are actually driving growth or just making things more complicated for everyone.
Makes you wonder if less can sometimes truly be more, even for a giant like McDonald's.
Absolutely. And it's not just these big corporations here. Remember A-Type 1, steak sauce?
Yeah, of course. Amazing on a steak. Can't say I've ever seen it on chicken, though.
You got it. They tried to make that leap, become A.1 poultry sauce. But it just never stuck. Consumers, they couldn't wrap their heads around that shift. And it just goes to show, even a strong brand can't just assume their name will magically guarantee success when they jump into a whole different category.
Building on that idea of focus, you mentioned earlier how Ries connects it to globalization, and that sounds kind of counterintuitive. Wouldn't a global market, wouldn't that require companies to be even more diverse to, reach everyone?
And that's what's so fascinating about Ries's argument. He flips that whole idea on its head. He says globalization actually pushes companies to specialize even more. Because it's a world of niches now. The winners, they're the ones who become absolute masters of one specific thing.
So can you give me an example of that in the real world?
Sure, look at the athletic shoe market. Nike and Reebok, they were both hyper-focused brands, and they completely left those traditional giants like, say, Florsheim and US Shoe in the dust. Why? Because they understood that in a global marketplace, consumers, they have more choices than ever before. So to stand out, you need to really own a specific space in the consumer's mind.
Right. So it's not enough to be good at a bunch of different things. You need to be the absolute best at one thing, especially when you're competing on a global scale.
You nailed it. And this brings us to another concept that Ries kind of challenges, this whole idea of technological convergence, which was a really hot topic back then.
Okay, break that down for me a bit. What's technological convergence and why does it even matter when we're talking about focus?
Okay, so it's this idea that eventually all these different technologies, they're just going to merge into one, like, ultimate device. But Ries, he argues that more often than not, technology actually pushes us towards greater specialization, not convergence.
So instead of having one gadget that does it all, We end up with like a bunch of different gadgets that each do one thing really well.
Exactly. Think about those combo TV VCRs that flopped, or like those early personal digital assistants, Apple's Newton, for example. They tried to cram way too much into one device and ended up appealing to, well, nobody.
Gotcha. Starting to see the pattern here. It's like trying to be a jack of all trades. You end up mastering none, right?
You got it. And Ries, he uses a pretty funny example to drive this point home, the amphicar.
Oh, I have a feeling this is going to be good. What's an amphicar?
So picture this ambitious attempt to create this car-boat hybrid. The result, well, it drove like a boat and floated like a car, perfectly illustrating what can go wrong when you try to do too much at once.
Oof, yeah. Sometimes the best way to stay afloat is to stick to what you do best, whether you're on land or at sea.
Well said. And then Ries shifts his attention to the retail sector, which back then was going through this huge transformation. He saw those specialty stores popping up everywhere as a clear sign of this shift towards, that sharper focus.
I remember those days. It felt like every week there was a new specialized store opening up. But why were the traditional department stores having such a hard time keeping up?
Because they were being outmaneuvered by these new players who had a laser focus on specific niches. Suddenly, instead of just going to one department store for everything, you had the Limited, the Gap, Victoria's Secret for clothing, Circuit City, Best Buy for electronics, Home Depot for home improvement, Office Depot for office supplies, and each of them offered way more selection and expertise within their specific category.
It's like each store, they owned a specific word in the mind of the customer.
Bingo. You're already picking up on one of Ries's key concepts. He argues that the most successful brands, they become synonymous with a specific word or category in the consumer's mind.
And that really played out well for some of those specialty retailers.
Right.
Like, think about Toys R Us. They had more toys than even the biggest department stores could handle.
They were the toy destination, no question. They had that depth of selection that the department stores just couldn't match. Then you have PetSmart, which really showed that this whole superstore concept, it could work even in a niche like pet supplies.
And Baby Superstore, they did the same thing for baby products. Their slogan was, "Prices are born here and raised elsewhere." Pretty catchy.
Very clever. It captured their focus, offering the absolute lowest prices for baby stuff, which just solidified their position in the consumer's mind even further.
This is all super interesting, but I'm curious to see how these ideas play out in like a head-to-head battle. Does Ries give us any examples of two major players going at it with totally different approaches to focus?
You're in luck. Ries dedicates a whole chapter to this fascinating case study, Coca-Cola versus PepsiCo. Welcome back. Before we got into that Coke and Pepsi rivalry, we were talking about how some companies, they use this kind of multi-step focus to really dominate a market. The example you gave from the car world, it really illustrates this perfectly.
You're talking about Saturn, right? GM's attempt to build a brand that was specifically for those import buyers.
Exactly. And you know what? At first, it was a huge success. Huge EE. They had that totally unique identity, their own dealerships, a customer base that was like fiercely loyal. They'd really captured that whole anti-GM vibe, appealing to people who are looking for something, well, different.
But then, if I remember right, things kind of went south for Saturn. What happened there? Did they lose that focus?
That's exactly what Ries argues. Instead of sticking to what made them successful, GM, they started expanding that Saturn line, adding those bigger models, even thinking about an electric car at one point.
So they kind of fell into that trap of thinking that bigger is always better.
Seems like it. Ries, he suggests they should have done the opposite. Narrowed that focus even more, maybe even dropped the station wagon, which wasn't really selling that well. He says it was more important to reinforce that core identity, that word that Saturn owned in the buyer's mind.
It's so counterintuitive, right? When something's working, the natural instinct is to do more of it, to offer more options. But Ries is saying that sometimes the key to lasting success is knowing when to say NO to expansion.
It's about discipline, having the conviction to stick to that core strategy, even when the market's tempting you with all these shiny new opportunities. A great contrast to Saturn is Chrysler and their Neon model.
The Neon. Yeah, I remember those. They were everywhere for a while.
They were. But Ries, he argues that Chrysler, they made a fundamental mistake. They put all their energy into Neon the model, not Neon the brand.
I'm not sure I follow you there. What's the difference?
It's subtle, but it's crucial. They were putting out all these different Neon models, different features, different price points, trying to be all things to all people. But What Ries points out is that car buyers, they're way more influenced by what their friends and neighbors are driving than by some fancy ad campaign. It's about word of mouth, about building that strong brand reputation over time.
So instead of building that solid brand identity for neon, they were spreading their marketing too thin, trying to appeal to everyone.
Exactly. And this brings us to one of Ries's most important principles. The road to success, it's paved with brands, not models. Yeah, launching new brands, it's expensive, but that's the foundation of a lasting strategy.
This is giving you a lot to think about. It's like building a house, right? You need a solid foundation before you start adding rooms and fancy features.
Perfect analogy. And this focus thing, it's not just for established companies or product lines. Ries takes it a step further and talks about what he calls the next generation of products and services.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does he mean by the next generation?
He's talking about those big shifts in technology, in society, that create these opportunities for brand new players to disrupt the status quo. He argues that every industry, every single one, goes through these moments of change, and the companies that survive, they're the ones who can adapt and really embrace that next generation.
Can you give me a real-world example of what this looks like?
Think about the rise of digital photography. Kodak, they were the kings of film, but they totally missed the boat on the digital revolution, and they had the resources, they had the technology, they could have been leaders.
Yeah, I remember them trying to catch up with that Kodak digital science brand, but it never really took off.
Exactly. And Ries says the name itself was part of the problem, digital science. It's generic, right? And then it had that Kodak name attached to it, a name that was so tied to traditional photography. It's like they were trying to straddle these two worlds, clinging to the past while trying to jump into the future. It just didn't work.
Sounds like they were too afraid to really commit to that next generation, maybe because they were so successful with the old one.
That's a common trap, and like Ries, he highlights it throughout the book. Companies get so attached to their past wins that they don't see the world changing around them. And it's not just Kodak. Wang Laboratories, that's another cautionary tale.
Weren't they the big players in word processing?
Yep, but they failed to adapt to the rise of personal computers. They just couldn't see that the next generation was already here, and they paid the price.
It's a reminder that even the biggest, most successful companies, they can become obsolete if they don't adapt.
Absolutely. And we can't forget Porsche. They thought they could broaden their market by offering those less expensive models, but it actually ended up hurting their image as a high-end brand, and sales of their flagship 911, they took a hit.
So the takeaway here is that when that next generation arrives, you got to go all in, right?
Yeah.
No half measures, no looking back.
You got it. Ries, he uses this powerful image of burning the ships when you land on a new shore. There's no going back, so you're forced to commit fully to that new challenge. It's a bold move, but sometimes that's what it takes.
And it sends a strong message to everyone, inside and outside the company, that you're serious about embracing the future.
Exactly. But there's another layer to this. Ries also throws out this really thought-provoking question. Will the next generation even amount to anything? He points out that companies, they often underestimate the potential of these emerging trends, dismissing them as fads or niche markets.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap? How do we know which trends are actually worth betting on?
Ries, he offers some really valuable insights here. He says, first, you got to recognize that the next generation, it rarely looks like this huge opportunity right away. It might seem small, insignificant, maybe even a little weird at first, but if you just dismiss it out of hand, you risk missing out on a massive shift in the market.
That's like that saying, the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all.
Exactly. And Ries stresses the importance of moving boldly when the time is right. Don't be timid. Don't hesitate when you're crossing that trench into a new category. He uses some great examples of companies that made these big, decisive moves and, reap the rewards.
Like Procter & Gamble going all in with Alev. They spent a fortune on advertising to establish this next generation painkiller. It was a gamble, but it paid off big time.
And then you have Honda creating this whole separate dealer network for Acura, their luxury brand. They knew they couldn't just slap a new name on an existing Honda and expect it to compete with, like Mercedes and BMW. They had to create this distinct identity, a whole new experience for Acura to succeed.
And Callaway Golf, they completely changed the game with their Big Bertha driver, creating this whole new category of golf clubs.
That's a fantastic example of a company that wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. They had that vision to see the potential of this next generation technology and the guts to really go for it.
So crossing the trench successfully, it takes a combination of vision, courage, and that willingness to fully commit to the new opportunity.
You got it. It's not for the faint of heart. But Ries, he goes beyond just identifying the next generation. He also gives us this framework for developing a long-term focus, something that can help companies navigate those changes and stay ahead of the curve. He outlines these 15 key principles, and they're relevant for anyone, whether you're running a company or just figuring out your own personal path.
Okay, so let's dive into those principles. What's the first one?
Ries's first principle: a focus should be simple. The best ones, they can be boiled down to a single word or phrase.
Volvo, Safety, FedEx, overnight. Simple, powerful, memorable.
Exactly. But Ries points out that actually coming up with that simple focus, it's surprisingly hard. It takes a lot of thought, a lot of discipline to boil your essence down to that one core idea. It can't be forced, it can't be manufactured in some brainstorming session.
So it's not just about coming up with a catchy slogan. It's about identifying that one thing that really sets you apart and something you can actually deliver on consistently.
You got it. And Riz's second principle builds on that. A focus, it has to be memorable. It needs to stick in the customer's mind, or it's useless.
Think about Nike's Just Do It. 3 simple words. Instantly recognizable. Incredibly motivating.
That's the power of a memorable focus. And Riz, he gives this great example of Subaru and their tagline, inexpensive and built to stay that way. He says if they'd just said inexpensive, it wouldn't have had the same impact. But by adding that extra phrase, they made it memorable, conveying a message of value and durability.
It's like finding that hook, that little twist that makes your focus stand out and stick in the consumer's mind.
Exactly. Now, this next principle might surprise you. Rizes argues that companies that really understand their industry, they often underestimate their own potential.
Wait, what? Why would that be?
Because they get so focused on the competition, on what everyone else is doing, that they lose sight of their own strengths, their own opportunities. They get caught up in the current landscape and they miss out on the possibilities for innovation.
I see. It's about finding that balance between respecting the competition and at the same time believing in your own ability to create something truly unique and valuable.
You said it perfectly. And this ties into another important principle, a focus. It has to be consistent with reality. It can't be some made-up fantasy or wishful thinking.
No more, we're going to be the next Google from companies that don't even know how to build a search engine.
Exactly. You can't be all things to all people. You can't be the low-cost provider and the premium brand at the same time. You got to pick a lane and stick to it.
I guess that's why companies that try to be everything to everyone often end up being nothing special to anyone.
Precisely. And that brings us to another crucial point. A focus needs to be maintained over time. You can't just declare your focus and then, poof, forget about it.
Right. It's not a one-time thing. It's a constant commitment.
Exactly. And that can be really, really tough, especially when you're under pressure to grow no matter what, or when those tempting new opportunities come along. But a truly powerful focus is something you commit to for the long haul. It's about staying the course, even when things get tough or the market changes.
This kind of brings us back to what we were talking about earlier with line extensions and companies trying to expand into too many different areas. It seems like that kind of unchecked growth can actually be harmful to focus.
You're absolutely right. Ries, he dedicates a whole chapter to debunking this belief, this idea that bigger is always better. He argues that growth for the sake of growth can be incredibly destructive.
Can you give me an example of a company that fell into this trap?
He uses the example of MCI. They were incredibly successful when they were focused on competing with AT&T in the long-distance market, but then they started branching out into all these other businesses, and their growth just stalled.
It's like they lost that laser focus that had made them so successful in the first place.
Exactly. And Ries, he contrasts this with a company like Silicon Graphics, which bet big on 3D computing and rode that wave to incredible growth. They were narrowly focused, but they were passionate about their chosen path, and they had this clear vision of how it could change the world.
So it's not just about picking a lane. It's about picking a lane that you're genuinely excited about and then going all in.
You said it perfectly. And that brings us to another crucial principle. A focus needs to be based on a unique idea or concept. You can't just be another Me Too product or service.
Right. You need a reason to exist, a story that separates you from the crowd.
Exactly. Ries, he's adamant about this. He uses the example of Memphis billing itself as America's distribution center. It's not just a random claim, right? It's based on their central location, their infrastructure, and the fact that FedEx chose to put their hub there.
So it's about finding that truth, that core value proposition that really resonates with customers and gives them a reason to choose you over the competition.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another key principle that really challenges a lot of conventional marketing wisdom. A focus should be based on segmenting the market, not trying to appeal to everyone.
I see how that ties into the idea of focus. Instead of trying to be everything to everyone, you're picking a specific niche and becoming the undisputed leader within that niche.
You got it. Even the biggest companies, they can't be all things to all people. Ries points out that General Motors, they tried to make Chevrolet into a brand that appealed to everyone, and it ended up being a brand that stood for nothing.
It's like trying to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one.
Exactly. You have to make choices, you have to define your audience, and you have to be willing to turn some people away. And that's where this next principle comes in, which might seem a little counterintuitive. A focus, it should be narrow, not broad.
Okay, help me out here. How can narrowing your focus actually lead to greater success?
Ries argues that the more narrowly you focus, the bigger your market share can be within that niche. Think about it. If you try to appeal to everyone, you end up competing with everyone. But if you focus on a specific niche, you can become the dominant player in that niche, and that can lead to greater overall success.
It's like that old saying, the riches are in the niches.
Exactly. He uses a political example to illustrate this point. Lyndon Johnson, he won the presidency by a landslide because his opponent, Barry Goldwater, was such a weak candidate.
So by narrowing the field, you reduce the number of competitors you have to go up against. Interesting.
In Ries, he makes this crucial distinction that companies often confuse growths with broadening their appeal. But he says there's another way to grow. Going global. It's better to be narrowly focused globally than broadly focused domestically.
That makes a lot of sense. If you can dominate a specific niche on a global scale, you can achieve tremendous growth without having to dilute your focus.
Exactly. Now, this next principle is about leadership. A focus should be driven by a single person or a small team.
I can see how that would be important. Too many cooks in the kitchen could lead to conflicting visions and a diluted focus.
Exactly. Ries points out that a focus is rarely the result of a committee meeting. It's more likely to emerge from the mind of a single individual who has that passion, that conviction to see it through.
Think about Steve Jobs and Apple, Bill Gates and Microsoft, Henry Ford and the Model T. Those were visionary leaders with a clear focus and the drive to make it happen.
You got it. And this next principle might surprise you. A focus should be based on thinking, not evaluating.
Wait, are you saying that data and analysis aren't important?
Not at all. But Ries argues that companies, they often spend too much time analyzing data, trying to predict the future. They get lost in spreadsheets and reports, and they miss the big picture. A truly powerful focus, it's based on intuition, on a gut feeling about what the market needs and how to create something truly unique and valuable.
So it's about trusting your instincts, taking risks, and being willing to experiment.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, not reactive. And Ries makes this interesting point that thinking and evaluating, they're actually two different skills. You need both, but you can't let the evaluators stifle the thinkers. The thinkers need to be free to explore new possibilities, and the evaluators, they come in later and help refine those ideas and make them a reality.
I like that. It's like having that balance between the creative visionaries and the pragmatic people who can actually get things done.
Precisely. Now, this next principle might seem a little counterintuitive. A focus is not instantly successful. Ries argues that in the short term, narrowing your focus, it'll probably cost you some business.
You're saying focusing can actually hurt you initially. How does that work?
Well, you might lose some customers who are attracted to your broader offerings. You might have to drop products or services that don't fit your new focus. You might even have to let some people go. But if you're truly committed to your focus, you'll be willing to make those sacrifices in the short term for the sake of long-term success.
It's like ripping off a Band-Aid. Might sting at first, but it's better to do it quick and clean than drag it out.
That's a great analogy. And Ries, he gives us several examples of companies that were just too attached to their past successes and failed to adapt to the changing market.
Like digital equipment. They were huge in the mini computer market, but totally missed the boat on personal computers.
Exactly. They were so focused on what they were already doing, they weren't willing to make the tough choices to embrace that next generation. And the same thing happened to IBM. They were so dominant with those mainframes, they just couldn't imagine a world where personal computers would be anything more than a niche product.
And of course, there's Kodak, which we talked about earlier. Kings of photography. But they couldn't let go of film and embrace the digital revolution.
All cautionary tales about the dangers of hanging on to the past. You have to be willing to let go of what's familiar, even if it's tough, to embrace the future. And you got to be patient. It takes time to build a truly successful business, and it takes even more time to transform an existing one.
So the message is, be bold, be decisive, and be patient.
Absolutely. And that brings us to that final principle, which kind of ties everything together. A focus, it has a long-term point of view.
I like that. It's about thinking beyond the next quarter, the next year, even the next decade.
Exactly. Ries is talking about building a legacy, about creating something that has a lasting impact on the world. He uses companies like, Ford, McDonald's, Disney as examples. They've been around for generations, and they've stayed true to their core focuses. They've adapted, they've evolved, but they've never lost sight of what makes them unique and valuable.
It's about having a vision that goes beyond just, the immediate future. It's about building something that's bigger than yourself.
Beautifully put. Now that we've laid the groundwork with these principles, I think it's time to jump into some specific case studies, to really see how these ideas play out in the real world.
We've talked a lot about these 15 principles for building that lasting focus, but I'm really curious to see how they play out in real-life situations. Does Ries actually give us any concrete examples of companies putting these ideas into practice?
Oh, absolutely. He walks us through some really fascinating case studies, starting with one that might surprise you. Harley-Davidson.
Harley-Davidson. Not exactly what I'd think of as like a model of stability and focus. What was going on with them back then?
Well, back in the 80s, they were actually struggling. Losing market share to those Japanese manufacturers, their brand image was starting to feel, well, a little dated.
So what do? Do they try to, go head-to-head with the Japanese bikes?
Nope. They did the opposite. They went back to their roots, really doubling down on their core customer, that American biker who values authenticity, that heritage. They streamlined their product line, improved quality, and really played up that image of, rebellion, freedom, all that stuff that Harley represents.
So instead of chasing trends or trying to be something they weren't, they focused on what made them unique and built on that strength.
Exactly. It was a brilliant example of refocusing, stripping away all the distractions, and getting back to the core of what made the brand great. It's a good reminder that sometimes the best way forward is to look back.
That's a great lesson for any business, really. But what about Ries's idea of dividing to conquer? Does he give any examples of companies that use spin-offs successfully to achieve that greater focus?
He does. One really interesting case is Dresser Industries. They spun off their industrial products and equipment operations as a separate company called Indresco.
Now, I wouldn't necessarily think that a company making, old school industrial stuff would be a hot stock. But did Indresco actually do well after the spinoff?
They did, and it was remarkable. Ries, he says a lot of their success came from the fact that Indresco now had this laser focus. They knew exactly what they were good at, and they weren't trying to be everything to everyone. They honed their expertise, targeted a specific market, and it paid off.
It's a powerful reminder that focus can drive success even in industries that aren't seen as, glamorous or cutting edge.
Absolutely. And Ries makes this interesting point about the impact of spin-offs on CEOs. He argues that CEOs of those spun-off companies, they're often incredibly motivated because they've got so much skin in the game. They're not just managing a division anymore, they're building their own legacy.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between renting a house and owning it, right? You're going to take a lot more pride in something you own.
Exactly. That sense of ownership, it can lead to better decisions, more innovation, a stronger overall sense of purpose. But of course, not every company gets this right. Ries also highlights some cautionary tales of companies that, well, they kind of stumbled when it came to focus. And one that stands out is Kmart.
Kmart. What happened there? Didn't they try to compete directly with Walmart?
They did, but instead of focusing on what they were good at, which was discounting, they tried to diversify into all these specialty stores like books, sporting goods, office supplies.
So they fell into that trap of trying to be everything to everyone.
Exactly, and it backfired. While Walmart was laser-focused on low prices and a huge selection of everyday stuff, Kmart was spreading themselves too thin, trying to compete in too many different areas.
Sounds like they lost sight of what made them successful in the first place.
Precisely. It's a classic example of how, overreaching and a lack of focus can lead to a downfall. Ries points out some similar challenges in the finance world, talking about companies like American Express that got caught up in that whole financial supermarket craze.
So instead of sticking with what they were known for, credit cards, They tried to offer everything, insurance, investments, the whole shebang.
Exactly. And Ries argues that this kind of diversification, it can actually hurt companies over time because it makes it harder for them to really excel in any one area.
Got it. So it's better to be really good at one thing than just mediocre at a bunch of different things.
You got it. And he points out that this applies not just to companies, but to entire industries, even national economies. He noticed that in those free market economies, industries tend to be dominated by specialists, not generalists.
Can you give me an example of how that plays out?
Think about the car industry. You have companies like Toyota, known for those fuel-efficient cars, BMW for performance, Volvo for safety. Each brand, they own a specific word in the consumer's mind.
That makes sense. But what about economies where the government has more control?
Well, Rees noticed that in those economies, you tend to see these big conglomerates that try to do a little bit of everything. And he predicts that as globalization continues, a lot of those conglomerates, they're going to have a hard time competing with companies that are more focused.
It's the David and Goliath story all over again.
Exactly. And Rees, he drives this point home with another example from retail, Woolworth. They had this like hodgepodge of different brands and formats, from Foot Locker to their traditional five and dime stores.
Yeah, they were all over the place, weren't they?
They were. And it ultimately led to their downfall. They were trying to be all things to all people and ended up being nothing special to anyone. They didn't have a clear identity, no compelling reason for people to choose them.
Sounds like a classic case of a company that had lost its way.
It was. And Rees contrasts this with the success of those specialty retailers like Foot Locker, which was laser focused on athletic shoes and had become the dominant player in that category.
It's a great reminder that in retail, just like anywhere else, focus is key. You have to have a clear identity, something valuable to offer, and a deep understanding of who your customer is. But I'm curious, does Ries offer any guidance on how companies can successfully navigate those transitions, especially when it comes to crossing the trench into a new generation of products or services?
He does, and he starts with a cautionary tale. Western Union. They tried to use their existing brand to launch a long-distance telephone service.
But didn't they practically invent the telegram?
Yeah.
Seemed like a natural fit.
You'd think so, right? But it was a total flop. Why? Because Western Union was so tied to telegrams, which were already on their way out. They couldn't shake that legacy. And people just didn't buy into their attempt to jump into this new technology.
Like trying to force a square peg into a round hole?
Exactly. You can't just slap an old brand name on a new product or service and expect it to work. You got to create a new identity, a new story, a new reason for people to choose you.
It's back to that idea of owning a word in the consumer's mind.
Absolutely. And when it comes to crossing the trench, Ries really stresses boldness, decisive action. He points to companies like Honda launching Acura with that totally separate dealer network, and Procter & Gamble going all in on a lev to establish themselves in that next generation of pain relief.
Those weren't timid moves. Those were all-in bets on the future.
You got it. It's about making a commitment, putting all your chips on the table. And Ries brings in another great example from the world of golf, Callaway Golf and their Big Bertha driver. That was a game changer, a product that defied all the conventional wisdom about how golf clubs should be designed.
And it was a massive success.
It was, because it was a next-generation product with a next-generation name. It signaled that break from the past, that bold embrace of the future.
It's a powerful reminder that sometimes you got to break the rules, challenge the status quo, create something truly new and different.
But what about companies that are already established in a certain category? How do they avoid becoming, dinosaurs?
That's a great question. And Ries offers this really relevant example. McGraw-Hill, the publishing giant, they had a really tough time crossing the trench from print to electronic media.
What happened there? They had the resources, the expertise, right?
They did, but they couldn't seem to let go of their print legacy. They spent years, a fortune, trying to develop these electronic information products, but they just couldn't fully embrace the new medium. So their past success, it kind of became a burden.
In a way, yes. It's a reminder that sometimes your greatest strength can also be your biggest weakness. If you're too attached to the way things have always been, you might miss out on the next big thing.
It's like that saying, what got you here won't get you there.
Exactly. And Ries, he draws a parallel between McGraw-Hill and Kodak, another company that had a hard time adapting. They were so synonymous with film, they just couldn't fully embrace digital photography, even though they knew it was the future.
Seems like the lesson is that you can't be afraid to cannibalize your own business. Sometimes you got to disrupt yourself before someone else does it for you.
Absolutely. And to wrap things up, Ries gives us one final inspiring example, Dole Food Company. They were huge in the produce world, but they made this critical mistake when they tried to launch a line of packaged salads. They used their existing Dole brand name, which was so tied to pineapples.
So people couldn't get past the image of Dole pineapples when they looked at a bag of lettuce.
That's exactly Reese's point. And while Dole was struggling, a smaller, more focused company, Fresh Express, came in and totally dominated that packaged salad category with their own distinct brand.
It's a reminder that sometimes being the underdog can actually be an advantage. You're more nimble, more adaptable, and you're not weighed down by all that past success.
I like that. And Reese's leaves us with this final crucial point about crossing the trench. You gotta have legitimacy. You gotta be credible in the eyes of your customers. You need a reason for them to believe you can deliver.
So it's not enough to just say you're the next big thing. You have to back it up with substance, a track record.
Exactly. Think about over-the-counter drugs. Most people can't tell the difference between the actual ingredients in different brands of, say, painkillers. What matters is whether people believe a certain brand works and is safe. And a lot of that comes down to whether that drug was originally available by prescription. It gives it that air of, like, authority and credibility.
It's about building trust, becoming a thought leader, an expert in your field. And that takes time, consistency, and that relentless focus on quality.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into Al Ries's focus. We explored the power of specialization, the importance of owning a word in the mind of the consumer, and those strategies for navigating those make-or-break moments of transition, whether it's crossing the trench into a new category or dividing to conquer through spin-offs.
You've seen the successes and the failures of some of the world's most iconic companies, and hopefully you've gained a deeper understanding of how focus can really drive growth, innovation, and lasting success.
As we wrap up, I think it's fitting to come back to that question that Ries asked all of us. What word will you own? What's going to be your focus, your guiding principle, your North Star as you navigate the complexities of life and work?
It's a powerful question to consider, and we hope this deep dive has given you the insights and maybe even the inspiration to answer that question and create a future that is both meaningful and successful.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you'll join us again soon for another exploration into the world of big ideas and actionable insights.